He was born into a house filled with silence and steel-eyed glances. His mother rarely spoke. His father never looked directly at him. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was punishment. Sharp, suffocating, relentless. No one ever yelled in that house. There were no screaming matches, no broken plates, no slammed doors. Just an eerie, charged stillness, like the final breath before a storm. From the earliest age, he sensed something was wrong. Not with him, but with them. He felt the way his mother's expression tightened when he entered a room. The way his father's jaw clenched when he heard footsteps down the hall. The house didn't just contain memories. It reeked of something unspoken, festering beneath every quiet dinner and cold morning. Birthdays came and went like any other day. No cake. No candles. No gifts. He learned not to expect anything, not even acknowledgement. He once tried to draw a card for his mother, a clumsy, crayon-smeared piece of folded paper. She took it without a glance and left it in the trash by evening. After that, he stopped making anything. Stopped trying. The only warmth came from his grandmother, a quiet, gray-haired woman who lived in a small room at the back of the house. She knitted silently and smelled of lavender and tea leaves. She never said much either, but her eyes were soft. Her hands trembled when she touched his cheek. She would press coins into his palm when no one was watching and whisper things he barely understood. Words about patience, strength, and waiting for the right time. Then one day she was gone. They said it was sudden. A stroke. He wasn't allowed to see her in the hospital. They didn't let him attend the funeral. He found out she had passed only when he noticed her door closed for 3 days straight. After that, the room was cleared. Not a single photo remained. It was as if she had never existed. But he remembered. He remembered her stories, her eyes, her scent. She was the only one who ever gave him something without taking something in return. His teenage years were a slow burn. No one noticed when he stayed late at school, or disappeared for hours at a time. As long as he didn't cause trouble or bring shame, they left him alone. He found work early, menial jobs, scraping dishes, cleaning yards, unloading trucks. Anything to save. Anything to escape. He studied in the shadows. Taught himself to move quietly, listen carefully, observe everything. He noticed how his father kept secrets in a locked drawer. How his mother made weekly trips and returned with sealed envelopes. He pieced together the quiet transactions, the careful lies, the way they looked over their shoulders as if fearing someone, or something. Secrets wrapped their lives like chains, and he learned the pattern of every link. The house grew older with them. Paint peeled from the walls. Floorboards creaked louder. But his parents remained the same, cold, pristine, and unreachable. They never asked questions about his life, his work, his thoughts. He was background noise. A fixture in their perfect illusion. Then one spring evening, the silence broke. He arrived home to find police cars in the driveway. Uniformed officers stood in the kitchen. His parents sat at the table, pale and tight-lipped. A quiet scandal was unfolding. Fraud. Embezzlement. Decades of deception. The family business, once revered, was under investigation. Assets were frozen. The house, no longer a sanctuary of wealth, began to crumble under scrutiny. He watched it all from the shadows, just as he always had. No one asked for his help. No one explained anything. But he knew more than they realized. He knew where documents were hidden. He knew names, bank accounts, buried details. And he also knew this wasn't the moment. Not yet. The fall was slow and humiliating. Friends disappeared. Invitations ceased. His mother wept in the dark. His father shrunk behind locked doors. They sold the car. Then the vacation home. Then heirlooms, antiques, jewelry. The grandeur drained, drop by drop, until the house became what it always was, a hollow shell. And still, they never turned to him. That was their final mistake. He waited until the estate was nearly gone. Until creditors circled like vultures. Then quietly, methodically, he began to collect. Not money. Not possessions. Information. He traced every lie they told. Found the people they ruined. The lives shattered by their ambition. He met them in quiet corners of the city, listened, took notes, offered apologies that weren't his to give. And he promised them something they never expected: justice. He filed claims anonymously. provided evidence to prosecutors, sent documents to investigative journalists. A cascade of revelations followed. What the authorities started, the public finished. Their names became poison. Their legacy dust. They tried to find the leak, tried to trace the betrayal, but he had left no trace. He never raised his voice, never appeared angry. He was just there, watching, waiting. Then came the final blow. The house, his prison, was auctioned. He bought it under a different name, gutted it, tore down every wall, every beam, every corner that had witnessed their cruelty. In its place he built something quiet, simple, peaceful. Not for them, for her. A small garden bloomed in the back, where her room once stood. Lavender and tea leaves. A bench under a willow tree. A place to sit and remember. He never told anyone what he had done. There was no confession. No gloating. He simply lived, while they unraveled. What they once destroyed had watched, waited, and risen. And they never even saw it coming. After the house was gone and the wreckage of their lives scattered across courtrooms and headlines, they tried to vanish, faded into obscurity. No apologies, no explanations. Just silence again. But this time, the silence was not a weapon, it was a defense. A flimsy shield against the consequences they had long escaped. He knew where they went. Of course he did. He had followed them for years, even when they pretended he didn't exist. Their routines were predictable. Their patterns never changed. One fled to a quiet coastal town, tucked into a modest apartment above a shuttered art gallery. The other sank into a faceless suburb, hiding among beige houses and forgettable neighbors. They thought distance would erase their past. They thought if they lived small, no one would come for them. But he wasn't done. Their crimes had been exposed, yes, but not their cruelty. Not the layers of control, the slow suffocation, the manipulative erosion of a child's identity. That kind of damage doesn't make headlines. It doesn't come with jail time or fines. It lingers in the dark, poisoning every step forward. He didn't want money. He didn't want fame. He wanted them to feel it. The weight, the loss, the fear of being watched. He wanted to give them what they gave him. Quiet, creeping dread that coils in the spine and never lets go. He started small. Packages arrived with no return address. Items from their past, things that should have been long gone. A childhood toy. A handwritten letter never meant to be seen. A photograph taken decades ago, now burned around the edges. They opened them with shaking hands. They changed locks, installed cameras, but nothing was ever caught. Nothing was ever heard. Then came the whispers, the rumors in their new neighborhoods. Anonymous tips to landlords, employers, local papers. Not lies, just pieces of the truth, placed with precision. Enough to make people wonder. Enough to turn friendly faces cautious. Invitations dwindled. Smiles became tight. Their isolation deepened, but this time, they had no control over it. He watched from a distance. Always from a distance. They still never suspected. In their minds he was gone, unworthy, weak, irrelevant. They had never learned to see him as anything more than an inconvenience. That blindness was his greatest weapon. He planted reminders in the places they couldn't erase. A scratched message on the back of a picture frame. A phrase carved beneath a stair. A song from the past played on a street corner as one of them walked by. Not enough to accuse. Not enough to prove. Just enough to haunt. When one of them tried to sell a memoir, an attempt to rewrite history as noble sacrifice, he was already 5 steps ahead. He contacted the publisher anonymously. Sent transcripts, documents, legal records. The deal collapsed within a week. Doors slammed shut. Their carefully reconstructed image shattered again. They moved, changed numbers, switched banks, deleted accounts. But paranoia doesn't need proof to take root. It grows in shadows. It feeds on silence. He let years pass like that. Years in which they aged rapidly. Lost weight. Lost sleep. Every shadow became a threat. Every knock at the door a warning. They didn't realize that he never stepped foot inside their homes. He didn't need to. They carried the fear with them. He built a life elsewhere. One that no one from his past would recognize. He never married. Never spoke of his childhood. but he thrived in the absence of their influence. Where once he had been afraid of becoming like them, he now understood that he had outgrown them entirely. They were ghosts, clinging to rotting walls of a decayed legacy. Still, he wasn't finished. There remained one last thing. The truth. Not the legal truth, not the financial crimes. The emotional truth, the kind that left scars on the soul. He compiled it quietly. Records. Letters. His own writings. Testimonies from people they had hurt. A detailed, methodical archive of generational rot. And when it was ready, he gave it away. Not for profit. Not for revenge. For clarity. He published it anonymously. No names, just facts. No accusations, only evidence. It spread quietly at first, among survivors, advocates, readers of forgotten forums and whisper networks. But it struck a nerve. Because it wasn't just about his story. It was a blueprint for how cruelty hides in quiet homes, how emotional control is passed off as discipline, how love can be weaponized when wielded by the wrong hands. It took time, but eventually it reached them. They recognized themselves in every word, every example, every quote. And worse, others did too. The towns they had tried to disappear into now looked at them differently. Not because of the past crimes, but because of what they represented. A cautionary tale of manipulation, neglect, and corruption masked as perfection. One of them tried to respond. Tried to craft a rebuttal, a self-defense. But no one cared. The public had already chosen its truth. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. And there was no recovering from that. In their final years, they lived alone. Estranged from each other. Disconnected from everything they once cherished. Their reputations crumbled. Their savings vanished. Their health deteriorated under the weight of unspoken guilt and persistent fear. They saw ghosts in mirrors. Heard footsteps in silence. And not once did they realize the most damning thing of all. He had never hated them. He had never raised a hand. He had simply given them space to destroy themselves. Their legacy, once forged with arrogance and silence, ended not in fire, but in slow, suffocating shame. And he, for the first time, was free. Freedom didn't arrive with fanfare. It came quietly, as most significant things do. No one congratulated him. There were no trophies or moments of public vindication. He simply woke up one day and realized he no longer felt watched. No longer flinched at familiar shadows. No longer carried the invisible weight that had been stitched into his spine since childhood. The silence around him was finally his own. Not a punishment. Not a strategy. Just silence. Pure, uncomplicated, whole. He moved again. Not out of fear, but choice. The past, though conquered, had grown stale. He needed distance, not from them anymore, but from the echo of who he had been while undoing them. The city he chose was modest, unremarkable, the kind of place people overlooked on maps. That was precisely what made it perfect. No history there, no ghosts. Just the gentle rhythm of days beginning and ending. His home was small but intentional. Every object had a purpose. Every corner told a different story. One of survival, of self-curation. On the windowsill grew lavender, just like the kind his grandmother had once pressed between pages of a book. A shelf held volumes of poetry, philosophy, old case studies, and silent reminders of where pain can lead if one learns how to hold it without letting it consume everything else. He worked in a quiet field. Something that paid the bills, required precision, but not too much of his soul. He preferred solitude. The idea of forming new attachments felt distant, not impossible, but no longer necessary for validation. He had spent too long trying to be seen by people who refused to look. Now he understood the power of not needing recognition to justify existence. He followed the aftermath of their lives with a detached gaze. One had entered a care facility, forgotten, diminished, financially strained. The other became a recluse, shut inside a crumbling apartment where the blinds never lifted and time had no shape. There were no visitors, no inquiries, no legacy worth preserving. They were alive only in the technical sense, existing in slow disintegration, surrounded by the ruins they had built for themselves. Sometimes he would receive messages, strangers who had read his work, though they didn't know it was his. Survivors mostly. People who saw themselves in the quiet agony of the details, who felt less alone after reading what he had compiled. They wrote not with praise, but with resonance. Their pain had shape now, context, proof. That alone was enough for him. Still, there were nights when the past tapped on the windows. Memories didn't vanish just because justice had been served. Some things stayed. The cold air in a particular hallway. The weight of footsteps behind a closed door. The way a voice could say everything by saying nothing at all. But he no longer let those memories steer him. He acknowledged them, then let them pass. Like wind through leaves. Present, but powerless. Years passed. The world changed. People forgot the scandal, moved on to new headlines, new dramas. His story had never been public, only the consequences of it. And that anonymity suited him. He never needed the world to know. Only they needed to feel. Then one winter he received a letter. It was handwritten. Old-fashioned. The handwriting shook with age. There was no return address, but he knew who had written it. The last one left. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't attempt to explain. It was short, sparse, almost empty. Just a series of statements, memories perhaps, or regrets, or something in between. A fractured attempt at owning what had been done, too little and far too late. He read it once, then burned it. Not out of anger, not out of triumph, but because it had no place in his world anymore. There would be no redemption for them. No closure wrapped in warmth. Their ending was theirs alone. And in burning the letter, he gave them a kind of mercy they never gave anyone else, the mercy of silence. In spring, he returned to the place where it had all begun. Not out of sentiment, but out of finality. The town had changed, but the bones remained the same. He walked the streets, past buildings that had once loomed like giants. They looked smaller now, ordinary. The spell had broken. The lot where the house once stood was still empty. Nothing had been built on it. Grass had grown wild. Nature reclaiming what cruelty had once claimed. He stepped onto the land, not to mourn but to acknowledge. The soil held memories but no longer power. It belonged to no one now. He scattered lavender seeds in the wind, just a handful. Not as tribute, but as punctuation. A quiet ending to a sentence that had begun in silence and ended in strength. He turned, walked away, and didn't look back. The past was no longer a place. It was a map of everything he had survived. And his life, his real life, was just beginning. The land behind him faded into the background like the final note of a long-forgotten song. He did not mourn it. He did not miss it. He carried no illusion of nostalgia. It had never been a home, only a cage. And its absence now was not a loss but a relief. The moment his footsteps left the overgrown yard, he felt the weight lessen from his shoulders, not all at once, but like rust being chipped away after years of rain. He did not travel directly back to his current life. Instead, he took the long way. He passed through towns that reminded him of nowhere. He slept in unmarked hotels with rooms that bore no memories. He ate quietly, always alone, in places where no one knew him. It wasn't running, it was returning to himself. The self that had formed in the quiet aftermath, after the noise of family, lies, and vengeance had faded into irrelevance. Somewhere along the coast, he found a house. It wasn't for sale, not officially. But the structure was empty, its former occupants long gone, and the agent barely remembered listing it. It had salt in its bones and sea in its breath. The windows overlooked a shore that changed with the weather. No neighbors for miles. No echoes of the past. Just space, vast patient space. He didn't hesitate. He bought it outright. He moved in with little more than a suitcase and a few belongings. Books, some documents, 2 sets of clothes, and an old, battered box of letters never mailed. He unpacked slowly. There was no hurry. For the first time in his life, there was no deadline, no calendar counting down to disaster. The house had creaks, not from age but from memory. It didn't whisper anything, didn't expect anything. It simply stood, and that was enough. He walked barefoot across its wooden floors, touched the walls like he was learning to trust again. Here, no one had cried behind locked doors. Here, no one had been punished for existing. Here, there were no ghosts but the ones he chose to bring. He didn't decorate much. Simplicity had become its own kind of armor. A single bed, a sturdy chair, a kitchen that worked, a shelf for books, a window seat where he could sit for hours and watch the tide breathe. He had no desire for grandeur. The wealth they had clung to so desperately had always felt like a trap disguised as a crown. He began to write again, not about the past, not directly, but about what it meant to live after survival. The quiet rituals of healing. The way scars behave in sunlight. The strange tenderness of building something new out of broken parts. He didn't publish anything this time. The words were for him alone. He had shared enough with the world. Occasionally letters came. Some from strangers who had found his anonymous archive, seeking advice or simply acknowledgement. Others were institutional, reminders of accounts he no longer used, invitations to speak at events he had no interest in attending. He read them all, answered few. He never heard from them again, not directly. But once, on a cold evening when the wind howled against the windows, he received a call from a distant lawyer. Formal voice, neutral tone. One of them had died. The remaining one, not long after. There were legal matters, inheritances, residual properties. The lawyer asked what he wanted done. He gave simple instructions. Donate it. All of it. No claims. No signatures. No footprints left in their name. He would take nothing from them. They had taken enough. After the call ended, he sat by the window and stared at the ocean. No grief came. No triumph. Just stillness. It was over. Truly entirely over. He left the house that night and walked along the shoreline. The moon cut a path across the waves, and the sand was cool beneath his feet. There was no one else. Just the hush of water returning and retreating, like breath in a sleeping body. And in that rhythm he finally heard peace. Not silence, but peace. He began planting in the mornings. Not much, just small things. Herbs, some vegetables, wildflowers near the porch. His hands learned the language of soil. He learned patience, learned the difference between growth and appearance. He watched things take root, watched them bend toward the sun, unafraid. He never spoke to himself, never talked aloud, but his mind began to shift its tone. The voice that had once replayed their accusations, their punishments, their absence, it softened. It became his own voice again. Not entirely kind but fair. Honest. Sometimes he dreamed of her, the grandmother. Never the others. She came in fragments. Her hands. Her shawl. The smell of tea. In the dreams she never said anything, but her presence stayed. A quiet validation that she had seen him, even when the rest of the world had looked away. It was enough. Years passed. Seasons folded over one another, like pages in a book he no longer needed to rush through. The garden grew. The house aged gracefully. He learned new skills, woodwork, fishing, preservation. His body slowed, but his mind sharpened. The trauma dulled. The sharpness of memory became manageable. He met people, on occasion. Locals who dropped off supplies or helped with maintenance. He was polite but distant. They respected that. They didn't pry. They didn't need his story, and he didn't owe it. And then one spring, something unexpected happened. He received a letter, not handwritten, not formal, typed, plain. But inside was a name he hadn't heard in decades. A name from his childhood, peripheral to the main players of his pain. A cousin. Forgotten. Estranged. The letter wasn't personal. It was a copy of a notice, a new legal battle forming over the remnants of the estate. Some distant relative now trying to stake a claim. A lawyer seeking historical context. A request for testimony. For information. He didn't respond. But something shifted. He began to wonder, not about the outcome of that case, but about what legacy he had left. He had erased them, yes. He had dismantled their names. But what had he built in its place? A life, certainly. A quiet life. A peaceful one. But not a legacy. He pulled out his journals. Read through them. They were honest. Sometimes brutal. Sometimes tender. Pages about loss, about anger, about resilience. Pages about how silence can be a tool and a curse. About how revenge can heal some wounds but not all. About how to carry forward when you've been told your life has no value. He began assembling them into something more coherent. A manuscript, not a memoir, but a guide. A reflection. He didn't plan to publish. But he printed copies. Sent them anonymously to support centers, youth shelters, libraries. Places where survivors might stumble upon them in a quiet moment. He never signed his name. He didn't need to. It wasn't about being remembered. It was about giving shape to what was once shapeless. And so the revenge ended not with fire, not with destruction, but with creation. Not with erasure, but with truth. The boy who once sat alone at silent dinners, invisible in the eyes of his own blood, had not only survived, he had rewritten the meaning of survival. And that, in the end, was the most powerful revenge of all. The seasons came and went, slow and deliberate. The coastal air thickened in summer, stung in winter, softened in spring. Life around him moved at its own pace, unconcerned with legacies, uninterested in the past. The house he had made, now worn at the corners and creaking more than before, stood firm like he did, quiet but unshaken. There were days when nothing happened at all. No visitors, no mail, no unexpected calls. Just wind, light, and the ever-present sound of the sea. On those days he worked with his hands, tending the garden, sanding old wood, fixing hinges that didn't ask to be fixed. He didn't fill time anymore. He let time stretch out, unrestricted by urgency. He didn't think often of the beginning. That life, that family, that house. It had receded into the far edges of memory. Not gone, but no longer dominant. The hurt was still there, embedded in his wiring, but it no longer governed him. It simply existed. A presence, like an old scar that didn't ache unless pressed too hard. Once on a dull afternoon in late fall, he opened a box he hadn't touched in years. It sat on the top shelf of a closet, forgotten, though not hidden. Inside were the remnants of the past he hadn't destroyed. Not out of sentiment, but necessity. Proof, perhaps, of what had once been real. A photograph burned at the edges. A letter never opened. A silver bracelet once meant for a child. He sorted through them not with sorrow, but with detachment. These were artifacts now. Objects stripped of power. He took the box to the fireplace, laid each piece on the flame, and watched it all turn to ash. There was no ceremony. No emotion. Just the quiet closing of a door that had remained slightly ajar for too long. That night, he slept deeper than usual. Not long after, a storm hit the coast. The worst in years. Winds tore at trees. Waves climbed over rocks. Roads flooded, and the power snapped off for 2 full days. He didn't panic. He had candles, dry food, water, blankets. He sat by the window and watched nature roar. There was a strange comfort in the chaos. Something pure and free. Something that demanded no explanation. When the storm cleared, a large tree had fallen across the field behind his house. Uprooted completely. Its roots exposed to the sky like ribs torn from a chest. He spent the next week slowly breaking it down, sawing branches, chopping the trunk, stacking the wood. His hands blistered. His back stiffened. But there was joy in the effort. Neighbors came to help, strangers mostly, people who had seen him around but knew little. They offered tools, labor, and shared coffee from thermoses. He accepted. Not because he needed them, but because refusing felt unnecessary. There was nothing to guard anymore. As they worked, they told stories about storms past, people lost, homes rebuilt. He didn't offer much in return, but he listened. And when they left, he found himself hoping they would come again. Eventually they did. Not every day. Not in groups. But gradually, the edges of his life softened. People dropped by to check in, bring fresh bread, ask for help with repairs. Children wandered to his fence, curious about the strange man who lived alone by the sea. He taught one boy how to tie fishing knots. Gave another girl an old book on stargazing. The house filled slowly with signs of life. Muddy boots at the door, chipped mugs drying by the sink, pencils left beside half-finished crosswords. Nothing grand. Nothing invasive. Just pieces of the world, left like offerings. One evening he looked at his reflection and was surprised. His hair had grayed fully. His face had lines that hadn't been there before. His eyes, though sharp, had lost their old weight. He looked like someone who had lived. Not survived, lived. He pulled out his last copy of the manuscript, now dog-eared, annotated, covered in notes he had made over the years. It no longer felt like a final word, more like a foundation. He decided at last to publish. Not under his name, not as a revenge story, but as something else entirely. He submitted it to a small press, one known for works on healing, memory, and personal reclamation. They accepted it quickly, quietly. No fanfare, no interviews, just a new title in a modest catalog. The response, though minimal, was meaningful. Letters came again, some from people who had seen their own families in the pages, others from those who had merely sensed a quiet understanding in the writing. He read each one, sometimes twice. He replied to most. One letter stood out. It was from someone much younger, a teenager. The letter didn't explain much, only that the book had made them feel less crazy, that they had read it in secret, that it had helped them name the feeling they had lived with their whole life. The letter ended with a simple line, "I'm going to be okay, I think." He pinned that letter to his wall. It reminded him why he had done all of it, not just the revenge but the aftermath, the rebuilding, the choosing of peace, because there had been a moment many years ago where he too had needed just one voice to say, "You're not imagining it. You're not broken. You're not alone." Now he had become that voice, silently, gently, without ever needing to be known. Years passed again, and one spring morning, much like any other, he simply didn't wake up. He died in his sleep, a book still resting on his chest, the window open to the sound of gulls. There was no struggle, no pain, just the quiet breath of someone who had finally used everything inside him and had nothing left to prove. The people from town came quickly. They spoke softly, respectfully. They didn't know much about him, his name, yes. His face, yes. But his story? Only pieces. Enough to know he had mattered. Enough to grieve. His house was not left to rot. A family moved in eventually, young, vibrant, loud with joy. They kept his garden, built a swing under the old tree, framed one of his quotes above the fireplace. And the book, his book, was passed around quietly, hand to hand, a secret map for the lost. No monuments were built, no eulogies read. But in the places that had once been broken, flowers grew. And that was enough.